welcome, everyone. Thank you for registering. So this is when you're going in for your annual checkup, whatever health insurance you're handled by, there's some things we want to be sure that we review with our primary care providers. So, but before we go into that, next slide. I thought I would just review some of the ones that I used in the, before I go there, here we go. So in a general routine exam, and all of us have had annual exams, so we easily can count 30 plus, but normally there's a health history to make sure if there's anything new in the past year, list of medications, any allergies, family medical history, vaccination history is definitely important now. Lifestyle behaviors, please go on. And this is not my original list. I actually pulled this from a primary care provider kind of, 101. This is what should be done. Vital signs. This is when they'll do your, blood pressure and heart rate and so on. Visual exam. Visual exam is not an exam of your visual acuity, but literally looking at you and seeing if everything looks right. I know many people who have diabetes who have never or don't remember if their doctor actually said, let me look at your feet. And that's a very important visual exam to do to make sure that there's no, gradually developing conditions that have to do with poor circulation. So muscle strength, balance, the joke with that little hammer on the knee, they never end. Okay, lab tests are ordered. Screening tests may vary from men to women. So I won't need a prostate exam, and I doubt my husband's going to need a pap smear. In fact, sometimes pap smears aren't recommended outside of a certain age range, but you can still ask for them. Okay, next slide. So here's a review of what I talked about before, and I'm putting this up front because it turns out that some of the same points keep coming back, and I just want to reinforce them. So if you say this looks familiar, probably because it is. So one of the things we did when I think we were talking about, may I have your attention, please, and nutrition and mental health. We know that a lot of sugar is associated with smaller brain volume, and not just sugar, but more refined carbohydrates, because there's even a difference between eating a whole fruit versus drinking fruit juice. But definitely the kind of refined carbohydrates shown there, like simple saltine crackers and pizza dough and stuff like that. Cornflakes, that would even be considered a refined carbohydrate. So eat less. It doesn't say never. It doesn't say dangerous, just less. And remember to include fish oil because you want omega-3 fats. So that can be in the form of eating fresh or cold water fish. Even if they're farmed fish, they will have some more omega-3 than others. If you're taking a fish oil as a supplement, I would definitely review that with your primary care provider because that can have an impact on changing your coagulation of blood. So that's a chat. Anyway, why fish oil? Because lots of research shows reducing heart disease, reducing inflammation, reducing stress and anxiety. That's a good reason right there. I call it my happy juice. It's happy until I burp, like a half hour later. And then I said, I don't remember licking the pier at the riverside. Okay. And then seems like omega-3 slows mental decline. Okay, what else was in the previous presentation that had to do with mental health? Maintaining a healthy weight. And it isn't as though having extra body size or extra body fat does something to slow you down, but it's also associated with a pro-inflammatory process. And less alcohol. I emphasize less because, yeah, I'm not ready to go zero, but less, not more than 1 drink a day for women or 2 drinks a day for men, which is recommended. Next slide, please. So when we are with our primary care provider, kind of all the little nuances, you want to know how's your blood pressure. I've had so many medical assistants take my blood pressure and they'll say, oh, it's good. And I'll say, I want a number. So you can find out what your blood pressure is, and good is still anything in the green range. Elevated does not mean that you are 10 days away from a stroke. It just means it's elevated, and it's then for your primary care provider to kick it around. So it's showing there that if the upper number is between 120 and 129, it's considered elevated. And sometimes people will say, well, we'll take it again in about 15 minutes after you've had a chance to rest. Or when the lower number is above 80. Okay, so this is what you want to ask, and make sure the numbers are offered to you and that you're clear as to how to interpret them. How many of you have been told when you have your blood pressure measured that your feet should be on the floor, so they shouldn't be dangling from the edge of a examining table? You shouldn't have your legs crossed. You should try to think of deep breathing or picture puppies and kittens. And that seems to have a very distinct effect on improving your blood pressure while you're there, because that concern called white coat hypertension is get quite nervous when their blood pressure is being taken. Next slide, please. So let's imagine you find out that your blood pressure is in a zone where you're kind of considered at risk, like elevated or even by definition high. The kind of dietary, I had a message on my screen that my Wi-Fi was unstable, so I'm not sure if you missed any of the last sentence or two, but I'll move on. So the gold standard for dietary intervention to improve blood pressure is to increase fiber. And the best sources of fiber are beans, vegetables, fruits, and whole grains. To increase calcium, and the good sources of calcium are milk and, of course, yogurt, soy milk, which has been fortified. I think I meant not to put a comma after the word soy. My apologies. Bones. They're thinking, wait a minute, I'm not eating bones, but suppose you have a can of sardines, and the sardines have bones, or a can of salmon, and the salmon has bones. Those are good sources of calcium, as well as many nuts. And calcium has a role with improving the signaling in muscles of the blood vessels to tell them to relax. Okay, lots of potassium and magnesium, and the same sources of those are mostly plant-based foods, so things that are the same as fiber: beans, vegetables, whole grains, and nuts. Omega-3, because once again, it's an anti-inflammatory, and its signal to the blood vessel walls is the relaxation signal, and reducing sodium. So I know there's often, we've had a question a couple of times with, if I say sardines, we all know sardines are very high in salt, because most canned foods are. So it's not about saying that it should be never a canned food. It's about how much sodium across the whole day. So if you have a high sodium, or not high, but a crazy, like a pickle at lunch, well, is high sodium. You can have chicken roasted, vegetables roasted, salad with vinegar and oil and olive oil, and that's a very low sodium meal, so that across the 24 hours, this total sodium is okay. And the more original the food, the less sodium will naturally be in it. Okay, next slide, please. So the DASH diet, and DASH stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension, was originally the result of research that was done in the 1990s, where in 3 cities, one outside of Boston, also Baltimore, and also Bogalusa, Alabama, where volunteers with high blood pressure were enrolled, and they actually got their foods given to them. Yeah, they had caterers, and I believe they got like maybe 17 meals a week, and they had their blood pressures measured weekly. And when they began the DASH diet, every person in the study of all 3 sites had an improvement, a lowering of their blood pressure in the first 7 days. And the composition of the dietary approaches to stop hypertension are, as described earlier, including lean meats, making sure you have omega-3 in the form of fish, lots of fiber, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. So these are the recommended number of servings of different foods. Okay, so that's blood pressure. Let's move on. So here is an image of the DASH diet. I don't know about you, but that looks good. And you might say, wait a minute, those could be canned chickpeas, and won't they be high in sodium? But everything else there is rather fresh. So if you put that plate in front of me, I'm going to be happy. I'll be really happy. Okay, next one. So the other question that comes up when you're having an annual review with your provider is, what is your lipid profile? So rather than say, what's your cholesterol, because lipid profile includes cholesterol, total cholesterol, plus the cholesterol found in the LDL particle, that's called the low density lipoprotein, the high density lipoprotein, and another particle called triglycerides. Well, a particle called very low density lipoprotein, which has a lot of triglycerides in it. And these are the recommended or the ideal ranges, the borderline, and the considered too high. Now, there is low, in other words, the higher the HDL, the better. So for women, if it's under 40, you consider that you want to look at what the contributing factors are. Sometimes it's diet, sometimes it's genetics. And most of the dietary recommendations address how to bring down the LDL cholesterol, not the total cholesterol and not focusing on HDL, but how to bring down the LDL. So your LDL in a good day would be under 100. If you have diabetes, the ideal target for LDL is under 70. Borderline would be 150 to 100 to 159, and then you see very high LDL levels of 160 and over. Okay, next slide, please. So if your LDL is high, we got a diet for that too. But we don't like the word diet, we like the words eating plan, because it does sound a little more inviting. Also, this one is the gold standard, and it's also been published as the result of research done in different sea populations. And I find there's something very similar going on here. So what's going to help with LDL? High fiber, beans, vegetable, fruits, whole grains. Increasing omega-3 fat, which has been found to help with, again, blood vessel flexibility. Reducing your total saturated fat and trans fat, increasing your monounsaturated fat, which is mainly canola oil and olive oil, and also including what are called stanols and sterols, and guess where they come from? Vegetables, once more with feeling, vegetables, nuts, beans, whole grains, and fruits. By the way, a stanol and a sterol are basically waxes that are naturally found in plants. Similar in structure, but not exact, to cholesterol, which is found throughout the body of all animals. So even when you take the skin off or peel away the fat, there's still cholesterol in fish and poultry and red meat and cheese. I guess you don't pull the skin off cheese. If cheese has a skin, we need to talk. Okay. So the idea here is the more plant-based your diet, the more things that have roots than things that have feet, the better. So next picture. This is, of course, I didn't create this. I stole it from Google. I put this picture at the end. Here are some examples of foods which are cholesterol lowering producing. And you see the beans for the stanols and the sterols and the soluble fiber. You see the monounsaturated fat depicted here as the olive oil and the avocado and the nuts. The whole grain shows the oatmeal, which is also a good source of soluble fiber. And poultry is above the red meat. So it's really not about not eating red meat. It's just about eating the total amount of meat per day. This is for cholesterol reduction and for the blood pressure. All the research says about 6 ounces a day, cooked weight of anything that's a critter. Now, 6 ounces isn't a lot for most of our styles of eating. So if a deck of cards represents 3 ounces of meat, it's essentially saying from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep, the amount of animal protein, which is probably supporting lowering or optimal blood pressure, is about the size of 2 decks of cards. So, sorry. I hope that doesn't sound too stingy for most of us. Okay, next slide, please. And as the emphasis is also on reducing saturated fat and replacing as often as possible with mono, here are the 3 categories that the American Heart Association emphasizes. Love it, limit it, and lose it. So I think I can live with the limited stuff. I mean, I like butter, I like heavy cream. I don't have to have it by the bushel every day. And the stuff on the far right, well, those are treats. Those are exceptional things when you just gotta have it. It isn't to say never, or if you eat it, your heart attack will happen by the weekend. It's just like, this is not a daily thing. Yet we see people doing it daily. Okay, next slide. All right. Another question that I often will think about when I'm getting an annual, do I have metabolic syndrome? And this is something that has a term or a phrase that has evolved over the last few decades. Not just where's your cholesterol and where's your blood pressure, but where are they relative to each other? So if you're a person in a thin body with high blood sugar, so that would be high blood glucose, low HDL levels, and high triglycerides, that's considered metabolic syndrome. And it's sort of a combination of things that suggest that there's stress on your vital organs. And for each of those, there are dietary strategies, pretty much the same ones that I've just reviewed. And if you're a person in a larger body, if you have high blood sugar and high blood pressure and high triglycerides, and you have fat around your waist, that is another way of defining or diagnosing metabolic syndrome. Next slide, please. So this guy easily could be who we call the one with the large body. And the idea is that when there are those different measures in the ranges that were just described, it suggests that there may be some stress on vital organs that can be eliminated or reduced with the expectation of a longer and healthier life. Next slide, please. The trick, the problem is when you just don't know what those numbers are. So if I said, excuse me, that metabolic syndrome has an eating plan, here's how it goes. That was me putting a little menthol cough drop in. You've never seen me do that before. So you want to include some things and minimize some others. I'm really being careful not to say never, but minimize. So minimize says as little as humanly possible, really, because we're all humans. And sometimes that cheesecake just has our name on it. All right, so refined carbs such as white flour, sugary snacks, sugar-sweetened beverages, and anything that's low in fiber. If you need me to give you some thoughts on what those foods might be, I have a couple of slides coming up. You also want as little as humanly possible saturated fats, like in red meat and whole milk. If you love whole milk, drinking whole milk is not the end of the world. It means you want to be conscientious about limiting saturated fats in other foods, but not to say all whole milk has to stay in the supermarket. And then processed foods and packaged items and fast foods, which all of the newsletters that I get on the nutrition and trends show that during pandemic, everybody was eating more fast food. Okay, so to include as much as humanly possible, lots of vegetables, beans. Wait a minute, did we say this before? Lentils, chickpeas, lots of fruits. whole grains, and omega-3. So the pattern is shown here, what the plate might look like. May I have the next? Okay, so I have a few more plates to show you. But when it comes to a few other things that sound a little trendy, they actually might be very helpful for that metabolic syndrome. The metabolic syndrome with the belly fat, the very low HDL, the high triglycerides, the high blood sugar, is the paleo diet. So I'm not one to sign on for goofy stuff unless it works. And this seems to have some promise. The eat column and the don't eat column sound very familiar. Now, potatoes are in the don't eat column, as you see, paleo diet rules. And you'd say, wait a minute, don't pick a fight with potatoes. And I kind of agree with you. The story is that potatoes have a high glycemic index, and they may actually contribute to triglyceride elevations in some people, depending on how much you eat and how frequently you have it. They do have in the don't eat column legumes. And I swear, when I come back in my next life, I'm going to be a pod of beans, because I think legumes are the best thing. So the rationale or the logic behind that escapes me at the moment, but the point being, there have been some studies in clinical settings where participants voluntarily followed a paleo diet and it improved their metabolic syndrome. So you should know about it. Okay, next one. And the last of the laboratory measures that you might want to clarify is, what is your hemoglobin A1C? This is also something that has been available for at least 2.5, 3 decades, but seems to get more attention in the more recent decade. So it's considered a simple test, and what it's doing is measuring your average blood sugar in the past 3 months. And the reason why it's 3 months is because it's based on a red blood cell, because hemoglobin is in the red blood cell, and red blood cells last for about 3 months, and then they kind of get recycled. It's an indicator of prediabetes, but it is not necessarily a diagnosis that says if your hemoglobin A1C is between 5.7 and 6.4, you're headed to diabetes. What it means is you want to look at what the factors are that are contributing to it, and it's almost the same factors that are in metabolic syndrome, that is belly fat and a lot of processed food, but not necessarily, but that's one of the trends. You can bring that hemoglobin A1C under 5.7% with some of those changes. Notably for most of us, weight loss, notably weight around the belly. So it's advised that if you're over 45, that you get the baseline A1C test. And if you're overweight, that you have one of those other risk factors considered. May I have the next slide? So this is my attempt at describing what that A1C means. So the red blood cells carry hemoglobin. So here we go. The red blood cells, imagine that they're rowboats and they're floating through your bloodstream. The bloodstream is the little river or stream. And the passengers in those rowboats are hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin is a protein, and glucose is also floating along that stream. It turns out that glucose and protein, or a sugar and a protein, have a natural affinity, and they find each other and they bind. So the more glucose is in your blood on average, in other words, a certain amount of glucose is going to attach to your hemoglobin all the time. But when the amount increases, it means that your blood sugar concentration has been high at some point in the last 90 days. And it could have been high overnight. It might be high following meals. You won't know that without doing a blood sugar test like every hour. And no one needs to do that for today. But it's an indication that your body's blood sugar has been having excursions in a range above normal for longer than it should. And that again can respond to some dietary changes as well as some weight loss. Next slide, please. So I'm thinking we've talked about the labs. We've talked about the kinds of things that will, if you get them from the lab or when they do the lab work and you want to get an interpretation and then what you can do about it. There are also some other questions that we all feel like we're just, like our get up and go, got up and went. So you want to know, is your energy level good, and can your healthcare provider give you some advice, and what kind of foods really help? So most important are, once again, whole foods. Many people will feel that after eating donut or like a coffee and white bread, that they feel the stimulation of the caffeine, but they don't really feel like they can now charge out and slay a dragon. You also want to remember to stay hydrated, and how much water, right amount. So I often keep this empty spaghetti sauce jar and I fill it with water and I make sure I sip from it, and by the time the day is over, I've emptied 2 of them. It doesn't mean you have to pour them down your throat and constantly, because the more you drink, the more you have to go to the bathroom. But you don't want to be underhydrated, and so often it's something that we overlook. I had an occasion to talk with a doctor about 3 weeks ago, and she said, you'd be amazed at how many emergency department admissions for older adults is because of dehydration. So just drink and pee and keep drinking. Okay. So everyone associates energy with vitamin B12 shots. I say get advice on that. Vitamin B12 requires, when you have it in food or in a dietary supplement, it requires something in your stomach called intrinsic factor to be absorbed. An intrinsic factor requires that your stomach be somewhat of quite acidic. And it seems as though as we mature, the acid level, the normal acid level of our stomach is not as strong as it was as when in our youth. So for some older people, we don't absorb the B12 as efficiently as we used to. But I still think you need to get advice on taking B12 shots. It's not something that I recommend or that I feel qualified to recommend. And a lot of times there might be other products on the market that say this is an energy boost, but many times the energy in there may have a little bit of something that sounds very exciting, like branch chain amino acids. But a lot of times, a question, how does it compare to a sublingual tablet? I think, Gail, I would go with the tablet. But once again, for the quantity, I would have your B12 levels done by a lab test with your doctor. And if your B12 levels are low, you can be advised to take a supplement. And I was going to say, so some of these other energy beverages are simply more caffeine, which, some hard-bodied 30-year-old can sort of go out and feel strong and run their 8-mile daily routine, but that's not working for me. Next slide, please. B12, by the way, if anyone wonders what foods it's in, it's only found in foods that come from animals. So anything that's cheese or milk or eggs or beef or lamb or pork or fish will have B12. It may vary slightly from one to another. So if you're eating an entirely plant-based diet, you won't be getting B12 unless you do take a supplement, which could be sublingual or just a regular tablet. And there are some foods which are in the repertoire of people who are vegan that are fermented. And the idea is that fermentation took place because of microorganisms and those bacteria, and that the bacteria will then synthesize the vitamin B12. But it's a little more complicated, and once again, to be sure, have your primary care provider do a lab test for your B12 level. Okay. if your energy level is less than what you want, you also want to explore other aspects of your vitality, like are you getting enough sleep? And I think we talked about this at some point in a previous chat or two. If you have a dog who, brings the leash over at 4 o'clock in the morning, that's not going to help you sleep. Or if your cat likes to snuggle. But otherwise, keep in mind that sleep is the #1 factor. Then physical activity. Are you able to get up and move around every 30 minutes? This is very important. And can you get at least 60 minutes of activity a day? And that's cumulative. So if it's 3 times a day, you go out, you do a 20-minute whatever, or 10 times a day, you do a 10-minute one or a 6-minute one. You got the idea. The more physical activity, the more energy you will experience. Next slide, please. So we were talking about making some of those simple swaps to say, if I'm trying to stop eating refined foods and I want to eat something which is more whole grain, has more fiber, here's some suggestions. So white rice for quinoa. You might take a white flour tortilla and use a corn tortilla or a whole wheat tortilla. The corn tortillas generally have more fiber because it's often a whole ground corn meal. You might try sour cream as a swap for Greek yogurt. Instead of a fruit juice or a fruit juice drink, how about infused water? And while I don't mind slugging down my boring Yonkers tap water, which I think is New York City tap water, nothing's floating in there, is it? Okay, so if you feel like you want to put a wedge of lemon or maybe a circle of cucumber, it really does make the water a little more inviting. Okay, so mashed potatoes to mashed cauliflower. I grant you the cost is very different, but if, especially during the season where harvests are bringing in a lot more produce, it might be cheaper to get cauliflower. And if not 100% cauli, you can do a blend of mashed potato and cauliflower and cut down on the total carb. And white rice, I said white rice for quinoa. Next slide, please. Okay, so you could do a few things that keep foods just a little more interesting. So instead of white French fries, you could do sweet potato fries. Instead of, actually, I'm having a hard time reading it because even for me, the word's a little bit funny. Instead of tomato sauce, you could try diced tomatoes. We're still talking about the fact that these would be canned. It's possible to find them canned without salt, but it's much harder and sometimes more expensive. So rather than rinse them and lose some of the potential nutrients that are dissolved in the water, just consider that there should be other low sodium foods other parts of the day. And whole wheat pasta is another swap. Next slide, please. Okay, so making the suggestion on all these healthy swaps, and yet when I am filling my grocery basket, those potato chips are calling my name. I'm not going to lie. So it's not that these would be eliminated eternally, but the more often we can eat the colorful fruits and vegetables and nuts and beans, the better. Next slide, please. I think I emphasized this before, but here we go. A fresh fruit, not a fruit juice or a fruit flavored beverage, is better, much better. I have many times been told, well, I juice my own. I put them in the blender. I had a whole apple, a whole cucumber, a whole pound of spinach. Well, that's certainly better than maybe a buttered roll, and so I won't bash it. But if you're gonna eat fruit, it's really a good idea to eat the whole thing. Okay, next one. I have no words. This slide speaks for itself. Next slide, please. So the last component, last part of today, before we move to something just a little bit different, is what about nutrient interactions with medications? And while I don't expect anyone to be able to read that circle, I've then broken the circle up. Next slide. But this is an article from the Wall Street Journal. It is not saying that the Wall Street Journal is now an expert source on drug and nutrient interaction, but they often have very well-written health columns. So if needed, I can come back to, next slide, Barbara, the content of the actual article, where there is a sort of a explanation of what some of the indications are on the circle, but now we're going to go to the circle, and if need be, I can come back to this. So I inserted it deliberately, even though it's kind of hard to read. Okay, last one more of those, and then the next slide. Okay, so much of it, we have heard a lot about grapefruit juice, and grapefruit juice has something in it that involves an enzyme system in the liver and also in the intestines. And turns out that the cholesterol lowering Lipitor, as well as a few other drugs, are influenced by grapefruit as well as cranberry and pomegranate juice. So here's a case of run this by your doctor. Best case is that you should separate your medication from the fruit juice by at least 4 hours. And it doesn't make the drug useless. It seems to have the effect of having more of the drug in your system for the first few hours and less of your drug in the system in the latter few hours. So it alters how your body absorbs it and how it lasts. Next slide. So now we see that the black pepper has been found to interfere with the absorption of medications. It delays the emptying of the stomach. Black tea also, not just because it's a stimulant, but other aspects of it could potentially interfere with the effectiveness of some drugs. And then we see here that chocolate may influence antidepressant, again, activation of these drugs. But many of the articles that examine this say that the average person is not eating enough black pepper because the stuff in black pepper is called pepperine, or the catechins in the tea, not eating enough of it for it to matter. But if you know you're taking a medication like Allegra or anything that you're eating a lot of those products, it's important to cover that with your provider. So the text on the left says that in theory, black pepper, along with medications that slow clotting, might increase the chances of bruising and bleeding. Who knew black pepper, this pepperine, could be so intense? Some medications that slow blood clotting include aspirin, clopidogrel. No, I'm saying I pronounced that poorly, but Plavix, we know that name. Fragmin, Levinox, warfarin, and some others. And this information here comes from what's called the rxlist.com about black pepper, and was updated as recently as June 11th of 2021. Now, I love black pepper, and I probably sprinkle it on most things, but the question is how much a person is using, and as to the ability of it to have an influence with both medications for allergy as well as medications that affect clotting. Next slide, please.
Gail says something about Eliquis.
Good one. What's the generic name on that? I can write it down and check real quick.
Okay. Go to the
I don't
next.
remember the generic name for that one. I'll write it here and then check on it before we end our session. Should I check the chat too, or?
No, well, I think that's it. That was it.
Okay, cool. Eloquence, gotcha. So next slide, please. We're still on the wheel. So we know that leafy greens can affect warfarin, and that has to do with vitamin K. Not to do specifically with like interfering with the absorption of the nutrient, therefore determining how much of it gets into your circulation, how soon or how delayed, but actually how the drug works. And what I want to point out is that many times a a provider will say, if you're taking warfarin, don't eat leafy greens. But the way it should be said is, if you like leafy greens and you're going to eat, let's say, a cup of leafy greens 7 days a week, then we will give you a warfarin dose, which will allow for the amount of the proper clotting level to be in agreement or align with the amount of greens you're eating. But if you just have leafy greens, like on the Sunday, the fourth Sunday of the month, then your warfarin doesn't have to be adjusted. But I think most people are so happy to be told you don't have to eat leafy greens. They'll never ask any questions. Okay. Ginger and, gosh, I think that word is chili. I have the actual.
Right.
Okay, chai, tea, okay. And how that might influence Tamiflu. Now remember, it's a combination of things which are described in the text that was in there earlier. It might influence how a drug is activated, how quickly it is absorbed, or how delayed it is absorbed from the stomach. And licorice has been established from quite a while back to interfere with some hypertension medications, notably beta blockers. But here's the deal. That's the good licorice. That's not the junk you buy in the dollar store. Did I say junk? Okay. The higher quality licorice that is imported, that is actually made from licorice root, has the active ingredient, glyceric acid. But the synthetic licorice flavors that you get in black jelly beans or Good and Plenty, you remember the Good and Plenty box? You could shake it. Okay, that's not going to have the glyceric acid, which influences the medications. Next slide, please.
All right, I'll do the next slide. And by the way, generic for Eliquis is apixaban.
Oh, now I'm even more lost, but I'll look it up.
Okay.
Okay, so here are some other meds that I hope you can see, anti-clotting, but it depends on the particular anti-clotting med, tamoxifen and porter-beer. And here is meat and the interactions with, and again, I have to open my version so I can see that word better, even though I made side notes. Here's the takeaway.
Beta blockers.
Beta block, okay. So it isn't to say that meat is going to destroy your beta blocker, but it's a matter of knowing the performance of the med and the level of meat that you're eating on a daily basis. I'm going to come back to the tamoxifen one also, so please go on. And the anti-clotting of the omega-3 is that it is definitely a omega-3 fats in high doses have an effect on what they create a prostaglandin or an anti-prostaglandin that helps to interfere with the platelet aggregation. The pathway may not be important, but what is important is if you're going to be on something for clotting, for reducing the chance of having a thrombotic anything, your omega-3 fat supplements should be evaluated by your primary care provider, the person who is prescribing. Okay, next slide. So I got interested in why tamoxifen and the beer were identified. And this is just a little summary. It seems as though alcohol can increase tamoxifen side effects and reduce its effectiveness. And why the particular beer and not all alcohol still is a little puzzling, but it was studied, and I did look up to try to find some summaries of the research. If one is taking tamoxifen long term, it's worth it just to leave the alcohol in the supermarket or in the liquor store. Next one. Then I got to asking myself, I've never heard of porter beer, and I thought I was a beer girl. So it turns out it's sort of balance of malty sweetness and bitter hoppiness. And the more hoppy the beer, the more bitter the beer, the more it may have this role with tamoxifen. But this is really for the beer connoisseur to determine if they like one. But if one is on tamoxifen, neither a malty or a bitter is a good idea. Next one, please. So not to be over and over with the same message, no longer strictly prohibits nightshades. That's a good one. So Leslie, thank you. The nightshade idea is that foods which are in that family, and I think the Latin name, because I want to impress you with, I can pronounce a Latin word, Solanaceae. Yes. And that includes tomatoes, eggplant, zucchini, tobacco, potatoes, and that these foods have something, and the something is up for grabs, that may exacerbate the swelling of joints, and that they should be avoided at all cost to offer the most comfort for the person who has the arthritis. Other researchers, I think this is a case of the evidence was not convincingly sound or unsound, which is kind of smack in the middle, but that when these foods were ripened completely, that substance was not active, whatever the substance was. But I'm aware that there's even less of a caution about the potential discomfort that one might experience when eating them. So thank you, Leslie, for bringing that up. So about all these dietary strategies that say the more fruits, the more vegetables, the more soluble fiber, the more stanols, the more total fiber, the more colorful fruits and vegetables, the better. The more monounsaturated fat. You see here from the Mediterranean Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay, suggests those 10 foods, which you've seen in this presentation at least 5 other times, and foods to avoid. And this is their word, avoid. My word would be as humanly possible to limit those same high saturated fat and high refined carbohydrate foods. Next slide, please. And here's what a plate might look like. And if you invite me to dinner or to lunch or to snack, and those are the things that I see these on your counter, I know it's going to be a good meal. I'm not sure about the salmon and chocolate as one dish, but be creative. Something could come with that. Next one, please. And again, these are the images that are part of the MIND diet, as the DASH diet, the therapeutic lifestyle change diet, the TLC, all good. Next one. So here's one where I found an article that kind of was the flip side of what I themed this presentation. Not what you should ask or review with your provider when you're having an annual, but the kind of things that a provider might ask you. How would you describe your diet? I haven't had a provider ever ask me that. And if they do, I'll say I do the best I can, all things considered. So the idea is if you could describe your diet on a plate, what percent of that plate or what sections of that plate would be your vegetables, your fruits, your protein, and your high carbohydrate foods. And a kind of an equal breakdown would be a good plan. And then that's what a healthy diet might look like to you. And your provider might also ask if you have breakfast. And that's an important thing. Only as a dietitian, I try not to label a meal. So I might not say breakfast, but I would say, do you have food in the morning? Because sometimes if you say the word breakfast, it encourages someone to describe breakfast food. So bacon and eggs, or cereal and milk, or whatever else might in your definition be breakfast. Whereas if you happen to eat warmed over lasagna, that was your morning food. That's good stuff. Okay. And of course, servings of fruits and vegetables. I think providers should be asking that, because if we haven't so far proven that there is a lot of evidence to support how that helps with everything the body wants. Here's more. Do you eat fish? And that's, again, this is what a provider might ask you, and that has to do with omega-3. And then medications. Next slide, please. Okay. So this one is often for me a giggle until I find out that somebody really, really, really believes it. Okay, so it's nonsense, and I hope no one's feelings are hurt by my saying that, but eating walnuts is not going to help you have a better brain. Eating figs is not going to make your scrotum healthier. Eating tomato is not going to strengthen your heart. Eating broccoli is not going to, the fact that these things, this doctrine of signatures, they look like something else does not mean that they are going to have a direct positive effect on anything else. Carrots and eyes, that's one that you say, but everybody knows about that. So the deal is, if you are deficient in vitamin A, it affects all of the linings of the body, which includes the covering across your eyeball. And that can become dry, and the more dry it becomes, the more chance there is of loss of vision. There's also a role of vitamin A in preventing night blindness. Night blindness means if you're in the dark and someone shines a bright light in your eye, how soon can you recover and see everything else in the room or on the road? So it's that readaptation. How long does it take you to adapt once the bright light is gone? And that is also an early sign of vitamin A deficiency. So yes, vitamin A and carrots are a great source of vitamin A in the form of beta carotene, has a role in protecting eye health. But it's not going to improve your vision. Well, don't I wish I could throw these glasses away if I ate more carrots. Suggestions about what to make to lose pandemic weight gain while also cooking for a spouse who doesn't need to lose weight. I would say if we went backwards to any of the other images, if you don't mind the extra washing and trimming and possibly chopping of fruits and vegetables and then whole grains, those can be really simple one-pot meals. One of my favorite one-pot meals is a gumbo that where you would take a pot with an inch of water, add 1 box of cut okra, 1 box of kernel corn, 1 box of lima beans, and then add to that 1 can of diced tomatoes and let it simmer for about 15 minutes. It's got all the colors, it's got the textures, it's got the fiber, it's delicious. And of course you can get real snazzy by adding all kinds of seasonings. Why not add garlic powder, onion powder, thyme, parsley, go to town. But there's a one-pot meal that's really quite simple and appealing. Next slide. I'm not sure if that was as thorough an answer to Leslie's questions as I'd like, as I could offer. Maybe that can be the next time we chat. Is pandemic is almost over, although I think we'll see. How do we eat our way back to normal? So this is I think this is my second to the last slide. And thank you, Loretta. The plate that loves you, over and over, approximately 1/4 protein, 1/4 carbohydrate rich foods that are whole grain, and the other half fruits and veggies. And then one more slide, Barbara. According to the 1730 Poor Farmer's Almanac, the recommendation for eating well was eat chiefly from the garden, the orchard, and the hen house. And I think we haven't really drifted very far from that. We have drifted, but we think the advice is still very valid. And that's the conclusion. The next slide is simply references. So Barbara?
Yes.
how do you want to go from here? Should we take some questions?
I mean, we're a few minutes over, but that's fine. If you want to take, if anybody have any questions, you can either unmute yourself or put it in the chat.